All right. Well, it is 6:30, so
Hmm.
we will go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's program, The Audacious Adventures of Nellie Bly with Dr. William Thierfelder. We're glad that everybody could join us this evening. Couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this session, so if you can please remain muted so we can get a good quality recording and type questions in the chat. We'll save time at the end to go through those. I'm also going to be dropping the link to tonight's survey in the chat. So if you can take a few moments at the end of the program to fill that out and let us know how we did, we always appreciate that. And if you have suggestions for other topics you'd like to see, we always like to hear those as well. Um, I did want to mention a couple of upcoming programs. I'm gonna share my screen here. So hopefully now you're seeing my screen. Um, and the first program I want to mention is actually next Monday because Dr. Thierfelder is going to be back with us um, to present a program for Women's History Month on the worlds of Eleanor Roosevelt. So Eleanor was a force to be reckoned with in her own right and involved in a variety of things, including the United Nations. So we will hear all about her work and her life, um, and we'll look forward to that. For those of you that are local, during the month of March, if you're a gardener or interested in starting one, we've got a variety of seed starting workshops with our local extension office. And we also have some plant swaps that will be upcoming. So check out our website for dates and times because they are too numerous to list on the slide. But looking forward to those. On March 19th, we have a hybrid program, Hike into Spring. We're going to be joined by outdoor writer Brent Frazee, who will be sharing 15 different places that you can go in Kansas, Missouri, and Arkansas to see spring wildflowers and other just outdoor adventures, just getting out in the nice weather, trails you can hike on, places for canoeing and kayaking or camping. Um, that one is at 6 p.m. It's in person at our Green Hills Library Center and also on Zoom. So you do need to register if you want to receive the Zoom link on that one. And then on April 2nd, Net Isaacs will be back with Turning Clay into Gold, The King, the Alchemist, and the Birth of Porcelain. So she will be telling the story of how porcelain was first created and became such an important industry in Germany. That one is at 6:30 on Zoom. And then finally, Frank Mendoza will be back on April 8th at 6:30 on Zoom with a program about Dame Maggie Smith, Queen of Quips. So, of course, we all know her from Downton Abbey, but he'll also talk about her work in Harry Potter, uh, the helping Whoopi Goldberg hide out in a convent, her Oscar successes. So, Should be a lot of fun on that one. With that, I am going to stop sharing my screen so that I can turn it over to Dr. Thierfelder and let him get started with this evening's program.
Okay. I hope, are we all seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, that is great. Well, hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the Mid-Continent Public Library, and welcome to the Learning from Home presentation called The Audacious Adventures of Nellie Bly. My name is Dr. Bill Thierfelder, and I'll be your host this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and a docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I'm an artist, writer, and lecturer. I also return regularly to New York, where I continue to enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple. Now, since we can't cover everything in one presentation, I'd like to invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, which is makingwings.net. And in this case, it's deeper dive number 1. And let me show you. So I am going to go there, and I want to make sure that I am sharing that screen. You should now be seeing makingwings.net. And what I invite you to do is to go to the hamburger menu in the upper left corner. And if you click on that, you're going to see a bunch of things in a drop down. Please feel free to visit any of these, including my lecture schedule. But you'll see this grouping of deeper dives. And it turns out that Nellie Bly is the very first one. Now, you can visit any of these. These are programs I have given in the past or will be giving in the future. But for tonight, it's number 1, Nellie Bly. And what you're going to be finding there is a biographical overview, some recommended media. We'll be talking about that in a bit. And as well as some printed and some video resources that I think you'll find interesting. With any of these resources, such as this first printed resource, if you click on that, you'll be brought to that page, and then when you're done, you click it off, and then you're back on mine. So it's kind of like one-stop shopping. So I hope that you can take advantage of that. So now you should be seeing my slides again. Hope you can do that. Makingwings.net. Now, everything that you're going to hear in the program this evening uses the web resources and the books that you just saw on my website. But for this presentation, I especially use the following to build its structure and its script. Brooke Kroger's Nellie Bly, Wikipedia, and the biography channel. All the photos that you will be seeing are in the public domain unless otherwise noted on your screen. Now, one of the things that you saw on my website was a selection devoted to suggested reading and DVDs. And I'd like to recommend 3 books particularly. Certainly, the definitive biography is Brooke Kroger's 1994 Nellie Bly, Daredevil Reporter Feminist. The book is detailed and thoroughly engaging. My one small quibble is that Kroger can get so involved in fascinating side stories that you can lose sight of the overall chronology. I found myself having to refresh my memory regarding dates and places, but this is minor when compared to the overarching details. Kroger clearly loves her subject and is always excited to share every aspect of Bly's fascinating life. A more traditional approach is Charles Friedman's 2009 Nellie Bly Daredevil Reporter. My caveat with this text is that it doesn't spend much time on Bly's remarkable work as a businesswoman, which we are going to be looking at today. But if you want to know about the great contributions that Bly made as a journalist, then this is certainly a go-to book. And finally, Matthew Goodman's 2014 examination of Bly's around the world voyage, which we will be talking about, took place in 1889. Um, it's really very exciting, and it's a bit of a page turner. And it talks about that there was actually a competition in that race with another woman named Elizabeth Bisland. We'll talk more about this. Now, along the same lines as Matthew Goodman's book is a wonderful PBS program that's part of their American Experience series, and it's called Around the World in 72 Days. It's available on DVD and also on streaming services. And if you happen to support PBS, you can look at it right there on their website. And if you would like to get a sense of Bly's actual writing, well, then these four texts are the best. Probably the most famous book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, was first published in 1887. And it's a compilation of the newspaper articles that she initially wrote for the New York World. Now, we'll be talking more about this seminal book in a few minutes, but simply put, 10 Days in a Madhouse was one of the first and best examples of investigative journalism ever written. Of a similar nature is 6 Months in Mexico, which was published in 1888, and it's another fine example of investigative journalism. Many readers find her book, Around the World in 72 Days from 1890, her most fascinating book. It certainly is for me. It recounts how she, a 25-year-old woman, traveling by herself with only a single suitcase in hand, completed a somewhat harrowing 25,000-mile journey around our planet. Again, we'll be exploring this a little more later. And finally, there's Bly's one and only turn as a fiction writer, and it's called The Mystery of Central Park. Now, I find the book charming, but most critics feel it's a rather mundane effort. I disagree. I think it's clever and well written. So, why don't you give it a shot and see what you think? Now, before we dive in, I think it's important to start with this quote by her primary biographer, Brooke Kroger. And I put it there on your screen. The problem with Bly's legacy was poor planning for posterity. Guaranteeing a place in history, it seems, takes more than just living a phenomenal life. In most cases, it takes careful attention to creating a documented record of that life that isn't too hard to retrieve. Well, Kroger's spot on here. For a woman who wrote endlessly, Bly actually left very little behind of a personal nature. She was a very public person who led a very private life. There aren't extensive diaries or journals or abundant photo albums. We have her newspaper stories and the opinions of her written by others, but very little written by herself about herself. So piecing together her life story can often be a daunting task. In her lifetime, she was one of the most famous women in the world. Yet within a few years of her death, she was nearly forgotten by many, especially the general public. Only in the last couple of decades has her remarkable story come to light once again, and it's definitely a story worth telling. So why don't we start our journey with Bly's own words? I have never written a word that did not come from my heart. I never shall. And that's the crux of Nellie Bly's work. This is a writer and a businesswoman who lived by her heart. She was passionate about life and her work. And that life began as Elizabeth Cochran. She was born on May the 5th of 1864 in Cochran's Mills, Pennsylvania. Her father was Michael Cochran. He was a wealthy landowner, businessman, and judge. In fact, The town, Cochrane's Mill, was named after him. Judge Cochrane had 10 children from a first marriage. Now, Nellie's mother, Mary Jane Cummings, had no children from her first marriage. Nellie's mother had no, as I say, had no children from her first marriage, but had 5 children with the judge whom she married in 1858. And those 5 children are Albert, Charles, Elizabeth, who's our Nellie Bly, Catherine, and Harry. Now, Elizabeth's relationship with her 10 step siblings and her 3 brothers and her sister from the second marriage is complex, to say the least. And we'll be looking at that in a little more detail in a few minutes. And again, if you want to do a deeper dive into all of these siblings, I definitely recommend some of the links on my website. Well, as it turns out, in 1869, Mom, Dad, and the first 4 children from the second marriage moved to a mansion in Apollo, Pennsylvania. The 5th child, Harry, was born the following year in 1870. Now, at this point, Elizabeth, when this move happened, was 5 years old. By this time, the 10 children from the judge's first marriage were all old enough to be on their own, so it was only the 5 children from the second marriage that lived in the house in Apollo. And you can see the location of the town on the map and a photo of the Greek Revival home on your right, and it's there on your screen. Now, according to Brooke Kroger, while Elizabeth was growing up, the young girl was known as Pink or Pinky to her family and friends because of her bright temperament and, most especially, because of the pink dresses that she liked to wear. And apparently, she liked pink for much of the rest of her life. Oh, but it is around this time, shortly after the move to Apollo, and around the time her little brother, Harry, was born, that Elizabeth experienced what I call pivotal event number 1. Judge Cochrane died in 1870. Now, at this point, Pinky was only 6. And the major problem, besides the emotional trauma, was that the judge died intestate, meaning that he died without leaving a will. Suddenly, the 10 children from the first marriage reappeared and, like vultures, sued for both the property in Apollo and what little monetary estate there was. The whole ugly matter ended up being administered by a court-appointed overseer, Colonel Samuel Jackson, who, among other things, purchased the mansion in Apollo for himself. Most of the estate was auctioned off by Jackson and divided among the surviving adult children from the first marriage. The second wife, Mary Jane, was left with a small annual allowance, as well as small trust funds for Mary Jane's 5 children, all of whom were under legal age. In this case, it's truly a case of riches to rags. And that brings us to pivotal event number 2. Mary Jane, in desperation, married a man named John Ford in 1873, who turned out to be an abusive alcoholic. Well, after 6 years of hell, Mary Jane finally had enough of the abuse and she sued for a divorce in 1879. Now, what made this divorce so pivotal was the effect that it had on the 14-year-old Pinky. She had the courage to get up in court and testify on her mother's behalf. She must have been very persuasive because the divorce was granted without question. Now, unfortunately, because of the ex-husband's meager finances, there was no monetary gain. But the real impact on Elizabeth was that the divorce made her painfully aware of the plight of women in similar situations. The divorce helped Pinky become a lifelong advocate for the rights of women, especially single mothers, and the rights of orphans, which we'll see a little later in this presentation. Well, Pinky immediately saw it as her duty to help her family, so in 1879, she enrolled in a normal school in Indiana, Pennsylvania. Not the state of Indiana, but the town called Indiana in Pennsylvania. There she trained as a teacher. That's what a normal school was. It was a teacher's training school. So she trained there as a teacher, hoping to use what little money was left in her trust to pay for her tuition. She even added an E to the end of her name, Cochrane, to become more of an individual. It was the first of many times in her life that Elizabeth Cochrane reinvented herself. She was now Elizabeth Cochrane with an E, a new person with a new beginning. By the way, in later years, it seems that her three brothers also adopted the letter E on their signatures. Now, unfortunately, the soap opera saga continued. Colonel Samuel Jackson, the original administrator of her trust, had promised her the funds to pay for her schooling, but in the end reneged on the obligation. Pinky was absolutely furious, but because she was under 21, she couldn't sue Jackson. So she left school after only one term. The following year, in 1880, she left with her family and moved to Pittsburgh, which you see on your screen, where they ran a boarding home and where Elizabeth engaged in a series of low-paying menial jobs over the next 4 years, while, much to her chagrin, her older brothers, Albert and Charles, with even less education, were able to land fairly prominent white-collar positions. Now, this experience of inequity became yet another lesson about the plight of women in a patriarchal society. And that led her to what I call pivotal event number 3. In 1885, Elizabeth read a demeaning article about women called What Girls Are Good For in the Pittsburgh Dispatch, written by one of its long-term columnists, Erasmus Wilson, whose pseudonym was The Quiet Observer. Now, you can see him on your left. Well, infuriated by Wilson's article, Elizabeth wrote a lengthy response in the form of a letter that she signed Lonely Orphan Girl. Well, the great irony here is that in later years, when Elizabeth had become the ace reporter known to the world as Nellie Bly, Wilson actually proved to be a very kind and lifelong friend and confidant. In fact, as her fame developed, she even signed her letters to him rather playfully as your naughty kid, Nellie Bly. But in 1885, oh, that friendship was definitely not in bloom. Well, the editor of the Dispatch at the time was a seasoned journalist named George Madden. He was so impressed by her letter that he placed a prominent note in the newspaper asking Orphan Girl, remember that's how she signed the letter, ask Orphan Girl to present herself to him in his office. Well, full of her usual self-confidence, she showed up. Now, rather than print the letter, Madden offered her a job on the spot. Until she got the knack of news reporting under her belt, not to mention proper spelling, grammar, and punctuation, Madden edited her initial contributions. Her first major piece for the Dispatch was an article called The Girl Puzzle. It addressed many of the issues that she had witnessed firsthand as a woman, such as the treatment of women in the workplace, at home, and in society. Another article from that same period called Mad Marriages included a vigorous swipe at her brother Albert, seen on the right of your screen, who, quote, lets his aged mother work and allows his sisters to support themselves where and how they will, while he dresses in the height of fashion. Will such a man make a good husband, think you? Well, the article was controversial to say the least, and as a result, it boosted sales. And that brings us to pivotal event number 4. Rather than a piecemeal article by article stipend, George Madden offered Orphan Girl a salaried position, but decided that she needed a pen name. And why is that? Because women of the time rarely, if ever, used their actual names when writing for the public. It was considered unladylike by many, including even other women. Well, what ended up happening was that men in the newsroom and the editors came up with Nellie Bly, the name of a song about a poor black servant written by Stephen Foster, who was a favorite son of Pittsburgh. However, while finishing the final edit on one of her articles, the copy editor misspelled the name. Instead of Nellie with a Y, he spelled it Nellie, Nellie Bly. Well, everyone, including Nellie, i.e., liked the variation on the spelling of the name, and from then on, at least publicly, Elizabeth Cochran of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, became Nellie Bly. Now, needless to say, I could spend a whole session talking about the choice of the name Nellie Bly, who in Foster's song is an African slave woman who sweeps the floor, speaks in so-called black dialect, makes the fire, and inspires a banjo player to write a song. Is this what the news editors thought she was? Well, nothing more than a slave to the paper who wrote as they commanded. Don't get me wrong about don't get me going on the possibilities, but be that as it may, she wore the name Nellie Bly like a badge and went on to become one of the most influential journalists of her day. So, Nellie Bly by Stephen Foster becomes Nellie, i.e., Nellie Bly, the reporter. Well, every week, Bly addressed the important issues of the day: poverty, child labor, divorce, and as we will see in the article on your right, what were called workshop girls, women who worked endless hours in factories in often harrowing conditions for just pennies a day. Her articles were superbly written and helped to boost the Dispatch's circulation. Yet, despite the success of her articles, Madden also made her write on female topics for the women's page: flower shows, bake sales, and church gatherings. Well, needless to say, Bly was frustrated. So frustrated, in fact, that she asked to do a series of first-hand articles about Mexico for the paper. And perhaps to her surprise, Madden agreed. Now, reading her dispatches today, you can tell of her concern for the plight of the poor, the exasperation at the corruption of the Mexican government, and the outrage of the overreaching power of the church. Well, when the Mexican government caught wind of her articles, they threatened to arrest her and deport her. So, seeing the proverbial handwriting on the wall and being no fool, Bly left. But once she was back in Pittsburgh, oh, she unleashed her full fury against the corrupt leadership of President Porfirio Diaz. Her articles created a sensation, and 4 years later, in 1889, she collected those articles into a book which she called 6 Months in Mexico. Now, despite the excellence of her writing, Madden continued to have her write for the women's page. And once again frustrated, in late March of 1887, Bly left Pittsburgh and the Dispatch and decided to try her luck in New York City. Now, during the spring and summer of 1887, she made countless attempts to get into the editorial offices of the major papers on Newspaper Row, as it was called. Now, on your screen, you see a postcard from the same era that shows City Hall, that's over on the left of the screen, and the municipal building, also on the left, and the major newspaper organization buildings that you see lined up there on the right of your screen. Well, after numerous tries, she finally got an audience with John Cockerell of the New York World, a paper owned and operated by Joseph Pulitzer, seen on the right of your screen. This meeting with Cockerell, and by extension with Pulitzer, led to pivotal event number 5. Cockerell, most probably at Pulitzer's suggestion, said he'd give Bly a permanent job if she agreed to do what was then called a stunt investigation. He asked her to go undercover as a mentally ill woman and write an expose of the notorious asylum on Blackwell's Island, which is now known as Roosevelt Island. Now, as a little sidebar, for those of you who are not New Yorkers, have it, and it's this. Blackwell's Island was renamed Welfare Island in 1921 and was used principally for hospitals for the poor. It was renamed Roosevelt Island in honor of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1973. The island, which you see on the left of your screen, shows, looking from north to south, is owned by the city of New York, but was leased to the New York State Urban Development Corporation for 99 years in 1969. And there have been a string of hospitals on the north and south end of the island. Today, the North End Hospital is still open as a training center for nurses and a rehabilitation center for persons living with HIV/AIDS, Alzheimer's disease, and other chronic illnesses. The central section of the island is now modern apartment and condo buildings connected to Manhattan by a tram, seen on the right of your screen. And according to the New York Times, an eco-friendly park will be built on the island within the next few years. Well, meanwhile, back to Nellie Bly. She agreed to Cockerell's idea. After practicing, and I put in quote, practicing insanity in the boarding house where she was renting a room, she went to a women's center in Manhattan. Her quote unquote craziness, as the matron of the center described it, was so convincing that Bly was brought to court for a judge to decide her fate. Well, in court, she gave her name as Nellie Marron, Marron, which is the Spanish word for the color brown, and said that she was from Cuba. She even used some of the Spanish she had learned when she was in Mexico to convince the judge of her supposed Cuban heritage. Well, it turns out that the judge was so moved by the bizarre story that the bizarre story that she told, that he asked newspapers to inquire if anyone knew the origin of this poor woman. And papers gobbled up the sensational story. And you can see a photo of one of those newspaper announcements on the lower left of your screen, right? You can say, "Who is this insane girl? She's pretty, she's well dressed, she speaks Spanish." Well, of course, no one came forward to say that they knew her. So she was brought to Bellevue Hospital, which you see as the background photo on the slide. There, she had a psychiatric evaluation. And after ruling out drug use, the supposedly expert doctors declared her to be, quote unquote, undoubtedly insane. In other words, so far, Bly had fooled everyone with her brilliant performance. And so, for 10 days in October of 1887, Nellie lived in the women's asylum on Blackwell's Island. By the way, the attendants misspelled her last name, Marron, as Moreno, Moreno. So, for her time in the asylum, she was Nellie Moreno. Now, these kinds of misspellings, by the way, were hardly unusual, as many immigrants who passed through customs houses can tell you. Frankly, if you were foreign, the spelling of your name hardly deserved respect. Meanwhile, Nellie took extensive notes on everything from meals to bath time and hid them away in her clothing and inside of her mattress. And going back to the spelling of her name, one of the biggest things she reported on was how immigrants who couldn't speak English were forced into the asylum because they, quote unquote, don't fit in. So you could be committed to an asylum simply because you came from another country. Well, at the end of 10 days, her editors at The World saw to her release and published her lengthy expose with illustrations and several searing articles. While other papers picked up the story at once. The articles were eventually published in book form in late 1887 as 10 Days in a Madhouse. Well, the effect was remarkable. Reforms in the asylum system throughout America began to take shape almost immediately. It's not an exaggeration to say that 10 Days in a Madhouse ranks as one of the 3 or 4 most influential books of its time, right along with Jacob Riis's 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives, about tenement life in New York, and Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, about the abuse of immigrants in the meatpacking industry. Well, meanwhile, for much of 1888 and 1889, Bly did a so-called stunt a week, writing about topics like domestic workers in factories, unwed mothers, and crooked lobbyists in New York and Albany. In each, she assumed an undercover identity to reveal the real nature of her subject matter. Now, today, we wouldn't call her a stunt reporter. We call her an investigative reporter. Now, we should note that Pulitzer loved Bly's work and hired other quote-unquote stunt women, but none of them ever came close to the brilliance or prominence of Nellie Bly, who by now was actually pretty much a household name. Now, as all of this unfolds, Nellie proved to be a bold, feisty personality who knew how to promote herself brilliantly. She was the Barbara Walters or Oprah Winfrey of her day and was able to interview many of the famous personages of the late 19th century, including the boxer John L. Sullivan and the suffragist Susan B. Anthony. Now, one of the curiosities, I mentioned this a little earlier in the program, one of the curiosity of Bly's career was published in October of 1889. And it's The Mystery of Central Park. It's her one and only novel. And as I said earlier, I enjoy it as a charming piece of detective fiction. Uh, don't get me wrong. Do not expect Line of Duty or Bosch. It's Jessica Fletcher and Agatha Raisin rolled into one, an Acorn TV or Hallmark mystery. But give it a try. I think you might enjoy it. Well, around the same time that Bly was publishing her Central Park mystery, Joseph Pulitzer finished building a new office for the World. It was 29 stories, which was enormous for the time, with a gold dome. You can see that there on the right of your screen. At the time, indeed, it was the tallest office building in the world. And to commemorate the event, Pulitzer decided that he really wanted a big, grand stunt for Bly to do, something bold, something remarkable. Well, he asked her for ideas. And that leads us to pivotal event number 6, Around the World. She suggested to Pulitzer and the editorial board that she should try to break the record of the fictional Phileas Fogg in Jules Verne's famous novel Around the World in 80 Days. Now, there's some debate as to whether it was Pulitzer's idea or Bly's, but whatever the case, there was a mutual agreement that her epic trip would make headlines. She would travel light, just one grip sack, and she would wear what became her signature outfit, a checkered coat with a cap, which you see on the left of your screen. Overnight, the 25-year-old woman in her checkered coat was as famous as Sherlock Holmes with his pipe and deerstalker cap. And so, Nellie Bly left on November the 14th of 1889 from Hoboken, New Jersey, on the Augusta Victoria. She had no travel companions, which was not only unusual for a woman, let alone a 25-year-old woman, but nearly scandalous in some of the more conservative circles of New York society. She carried with her one cloth bag for her clothing, and she had on her person 200 pounds in British currency and just a few American dollars. Most places in the world at the time wouldn't accept American money. So she made sure that she had her British money, which was accepted everywhere. Meanwhile, one of my favorite parts of the whole journey is when Nellie was able to stop in Amiens, France, to meet Jules Verne and his wife. Well, Verne, of course, who had written Around the World in 80 Days in 1872, and the famous French author, well, they turned into one of Bly's biggest cheerleaders, hoping that she would be able to beat the record of his own fictional Phileas Fogg. So Mr. and Mrs. Verne, they were cheerleaders. Well, as the journey proceeded, Bly wired her reports back whenever possible, or if telegraph wasn't available, she mailed her reports, which often took over 2 weeks. But whenever her reports were received, they became front page news, not only for her paper, but for papers around the country and the world. Indeed, many papers generated maps and charts so that you could follow her progress, right? A reader could track her progress in the newspapers. And as you see on the left and the right of your screen, Nellie Bly board games and guessing games were hugely popular. You may recall that in the early 1990s, there was a very successful show on PBS that ran for 5 seasons called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? Well, in many ways, the news of Nellie Bly's latest adventures were just as audience grabbing. Now, meanwhile, to create a little excitement, Cosmopolitan magazine created a competition by sending one of its star writers, Elizabeth Bisland, to undertake her own journey around the planet. Like Bly, she traveled lightly and alone. But her voyage was slightly different. Instead of heading from the west to the east like Bly, Bisland was sent across America and over the Pacific into Asia. In other words, circling the globe from east to west. Now, like Bly, Bisland was successful, but sadly, she didn't beat Nellie's record. She took 4.5 days longer. Well, still, it was quite a feat. And once again, I highly recommend Matthew Goodman's book, which you see there on the right of your screen, called 80 Days. It's a good read, and it's an insightful look at journalism in the late 19th century. Well, in the meantime, Nellie's voyage, like that of Phileas Fogg in Verne's novel, took her to faraway and exotic places, including a Christmas visit to a Chinese leper colony when one of her travel connections out of Hong Kong was delayed. The map on your screen shows some of her ports of call. And in typical Bly style, the end of her journey is certainly worthy of any novel or movie. On day 68, January the 21st of 1890, she arrived in San Francisco, where she was met by a private train personally sent by Pulitzer. She made it back to her starting point in New Jersey in 67 hours, which was a locomotive speed record at the time, especially when you consider she was traveling across the country at the peak of the winter snow season. On January the 25th of 1890, her journey ended, and it too was, at the time, a world's record. 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds. Don't forget those 14 seconds. And once again, let's not forget that our intrepid traveler was a 25-year-old woman traveling alone with little money and one modestly sized cloth portmanteau. Now that's something. Well, in the first few months of 1890, Bly was the name on everyone's lips. Newspapers around the world reprinted her articles, and Jules Verne himself offered a beautiful brava. As she had with both her asylum articles and her Mexican expose, Bly made sure that her articles were collected into a book, which was published under the title Nellie Bly's Book Around the World in 72 Days. She definitely made it very clear whose journey it was. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? As we all know, the news cycle can be fickle. And after a couple of months, Nellie's fantastic voyage had been replaced with other news items. After feeling what she called underappreciated by the world, the newspaper, Bly accepted a 3-year contract with N.L. Monroe's New York Family Story paper. And there she was to write fiction. Well, unfortunately, nothing came of it. And it grew into a tough time for Bly. Not only was she no longer the focus of everyone's attention, but there also were no major articles or stories coming her way. And to add to the downturn, she developed several unnamed health issues. Again, she very rarely wrote about her personal issues, so this is kind of secondhand information, but apparently she had a number of very serious health issues. Some people think it may have been heart disease. We don't know. But what she did do, however, was go on several modestly successful lecture tours. But meanwhile, during this same period, Joseph Pulitzer was having some hard times at the World. Circulation was off, and there weren't any major stories on which he could capitalize. So, after a kiss and make up session, Pulitzer finally offered Bly a job once again in 1893 after 3 years away. Her comeback was a highly successful interview with the anarchist Emma Goldman, followed by very revealing articles about political conventions. Finally, she got back into the spotlight. Her coverage of in Chicago of the Pullman Railroad strike of 1894 made her the darling of the union movement. Now, to refresh our memories, the Pullman strike was a nationwide railroad strike that began in May of 1894, and it proved to be a turning point for U.S. labor law. It pitted the American Railway Union, the ARU, against the Pullman Company, all the main railroads, and the federal government of the United States under President Grover Cleveland. The strike was successful in the sense that it brought an awareness to the gross injustices and did bring about some reforms. And that brings us to pivotal event number 7. And it happened the following year of 1895. While she was on a return trip to Chicago to wrap up her reports on the railroad strike, Bly took a leave from writing in order to marry millionaire manufacturer Robert Seaman. Bly was 31 and Seaman was 71. Now, how this relationship started, how it grew, and how it ended up in marriage is still subject to speculation. But whatever happened, after a 2-week whirlwind romance, the affection between the two seemed genuine, and they took the plunge. Unfortunately, thanks to Robert's alcoholic brother Edward, who tried to undermine the relationship, that first year of marriage proved rocky, but the two stood their ground. They stayed married, and they spent the next 3 years in Europe, 1896 to 1899. Part of it with Nellie's mother, her sister Catherine, nicknamed Kate, and her favorite niece, Beatrice. Now, sadly, when her sister Kate returned to New York in 1899, she contracted tuberculosis and died. Nellie returned for the funeral and remained very close to her niece Beatrice. Meanwhile, in 1896, at the beginning of that European trip, Seaman made Bly the sole executrix of his estate. And in the same year, Bly was made president and CEO of Seaman's primary business, the Ironclad Manufacturing Company, a company which made steel containers such as milk containers and boilers. She was the first female CEO of a major corporation in the world. Robert loved it. Nellie loved it. And it probably made that alcoholic brother Robert, who was trying to undermine the marriage, probably made that brother Edward absolutely apoplectic. But again, the marriage remained solid, and Nellie, by all accounts, was regarded by her employees with great respect. But sadly, in 1904, Seaman died suddenly, and Nellie took over the entire operation, making her a multimillionaire. Now, on your screen, you see an illustration of the Ironclad Company, as well as a yellow map of Brooklyn. You could see that over there on your right. It's Brooklyn there is in yellow. The factory is in this little section, which is in the color red there. Now, you also see in the lower right of your screen a business card that Bly handed out during the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, perhaps best remembered as the site of President McKinley's assassination. But look at the wording on the card. Read along with me. The ironclad factories are the largest of their kind and are owned exclusively by Nellie Bly, the only woman in the world personally managing industries of such magnitude. Well, in essence, the statement was true. Though there were other women executives in the world, her company was by far the largest, and she never let anyone forget it. There it is. There's that business card. Well, to top things off, she became an inventor, earning patents for a 55-gallon oil drum, whose design, by the way, is still in use today. She also designed a better milk can for transporting milk long distances, and she's the one who invented the stackable garbage can, which is an invention also that's still in use. By 1905, the year after her husband's death, Nellie Bly held 25 unique patents. Bly continued her passion for social reform within her company. Her workers enjoyed unheard of benefits at the time, including on-location fitness gyms, staffed libraries, and even full healthcare benefits. Yep, full healthcare benefits. Further, she expanded her operations and formed other businesses, including the American Steel Barrel Company. And you can see her patent drawing for one of her steel barrels in the left of your screen there. And the photo.
Rồi ba cứ đi chứ.
Uh, could everyone please silence themselves? We're hearing other people. Thank you. Where was I? Okay, the photo on the right of your screen, taken around 1910, shows her at the height of her success. Indeed, up to this point, the trajectory of her life had been, with few exceptions, steadily upwards. First as a star reporter, then as a world traveler, and finally as one of the world's first female executives. But many such stories take a turn, and Bly's fortunes finally shifted in 1911. And 1911 becomes the year of a pivotal event, number 8. In that year, embezzlement by a few once trusted male employees drove Ironclad into bankruptcy. The legal battles that resulted continue until Bly's death 11 years later. Her mother, Mary Jane, and her brother, Albert, who struggled with each other and with Nellie over the ownership and leadership of the various companies, especially the American Steel Barrel Company, were often at the center of a very bitter family war. Now think about it. Once again, Nellie had to endure the same kind of family strife that she experienced when her father died. His 10 children from his first marriage swooped in and tore apart what little security Nellie and her mother had. Well, now, after Robert's death, her surviving siblings from her mother's second marriage and her own mother, who should have been far more sensitive to the situation, ended up doing exactly the same thing. Once again, Nellie Bly, aka Elizabeth Cochran, knew the reality of why, greed is indeed one of the 7 deadly sins. By the way, on the right of your screen, you see facsimiles of checks bearing Bly's actual and forged signatures that were published in the New York Times during its coverage of the initial bankruptcy proceedings. Bly fought as hard as she could, but the male-dominated system often worked against her. And I'd love to share 3 quotes from Bly herself that sum up pretty neatly what she went through. The first, which is on your screen, comes from the Brooklyn Eagle, Walt Whitman's old newspaper. And it comes from late June of 1911. And you can follow along. Some of the creditors, and this is Bly speaking, some of the creditors are pointing to me as a business failure and saying that's what becomes from letting a woman run things. But the biggest banks and business houses run by men have been robbed by dishonest employees. That is what happened to the ironclad. Why don't they look at the sales that have been made during the past 12 years, at the steady progress of the company, at the inventions, instead of pointing to me as a failure in business? That's what hurts. The second quote comes from the New York Times interview with her, published on June the 28th of 1911. And she says, "They say I married Robert Seaman for his money. They are wrong. I had an idea, and I love business. Bertha Krupp and Mrs. Cadbury, who left their business operations to their people, were my only rivals. I could prove what an American woman could do in actual, practical, cold, and hard business. And 7 years after the burdens of one great plant, ironclad, came upon my shoulders, I added to that another plant, American steel barrel, almost as large. That was my success. And I was going to see if an American woman could not lead in the world of business. And did men help me? As wolves might help rabbits." Now, those last two lines are vintage Nellie Bly. They reveal the often sardonic style that marked the best of her journalism. And did men help me? As wolves might help rabbits. I love it. And finally, quote number 3 comes from an article she wrote for, in her case, the ironically titled publication Fair Play magazine. The title of her piece was direct: How I Was Robbed of $2 million. Now, remember, in our current market, the purchasing power of $2 million from 1911 would be probably $40 or $50 million at a minimum. Now, the article marks one of the few times that Bly put aside her bravura and spoke with great openness, and you could follow along. "I cannot blame myself enough for not having learned banking methods and commercial accounting when I first went into ironclad. But I never in my life had taken any interest in money itself because financial details bored me terribly." That's a very honest and very truthful admission, isn't it? She was a woman who spent 10 days in an asylum to create society-altering journalism, who traveled across the planet in record time, who helped strengthen unions, who thought of her employees first and foremost. Numbers and checkbooks simply weren't her strong suit, and she was willing to admit it. And her male business partners were more than willing to take advantage. But never one to give up the ghost, Bly went on to have a very interesting pivotal event number 9. To avoid some of the legal battles that were going on, Bly traveled to Europe, where she stayed with a friend and possible lover, Oscar Bondy, in Vienna. Thanks to another friend, Arthur Brisbane, Bly was brought on as a frontline reporter for the New York Journal, reporting directly from the Eastern Front during World War I. Always a woman of first, Bly was the first woman and one of the first foreigners to visit the war zone between Serbia and Austria. And to add to the drama that always seemed to find Nellie, she was even arrested when she was mistaken for a British spy. She was finally released on the word of friends who identified her as an American and as, quote unquote, the famous Nellie Bly. She wrote of her arrest in the New York Journal. Now, interestingly, as a person of Irish descent, she was vehemently anti-British and conspicuously pro-Austrian, which did raise some eyebrows among some circles. However, because she wrote so passionately about the plight of Eastern Europeans and Austrians during the war, She became particularly popular with German Austrian readers who were the largest immigrant group in America by World War I. So in most circles, there was sympathy and all was forgiven. Well, after proving her loyalty to the United States to prominent officials, Bly returned to the U.S. in 1919 to oversee the latest round of legal battles centering on the ironclad and its shadow company, American Steel Barrel. During all the courtroom wrangling, she continued as a journalist for the New York Journal with her friend Arthur Brisbane. In her usual fervent style, she reported on the suffrage movement and other social issues, especially the plight of unwed mothers and orphans. Well, the legal tribulations, especially with her mother and brother Albert, which included the sale of her home in Murray Hill, Manhattan, and the breakup of her floundering companies, made Bly nearly destitute. Her mother died in 1921 at the age of 96, and Arthur, the brother, dove right in and took all the money and without consultation sold off all of the family properties, leaving only $400 in the estate. Now, on your screen, you see the photo of Mommy Dearest, as well as some of the properties that Bly owned and lived in over the years, including on the bottom, the 2 Brooklyn homes she once shared with her mother. Simply put, it was all pretty ugly. But let's balance that ugliness with something quite lighter. Here's an interesting sidebar. Opened in 1966, Nellie Bly Adventurers Park is a family-run amusement park in Bath Beach along the water in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. You can see a little yellow arrow there. The concessionaire named the fun park for Nellie Bly because of her reputation as an adventurer and a former Brooklynite. The park features more than a dozen kiddie rides, including a miniature roller coaster, Ferris wheel, carousel, and a train. Although most of its amusement appealed to younger children, Nellie Bly's Adventurers Park also sports an 18-hole miniature golf course, batting cages, and even go-karts. The park is now officially a part of New York City's Parks and Recreation Department. So if you happen to be in the area, the park is located on the south side of Shore Parkway between 25th Avenue and Bay 41st Street. Have some fun. Now, this emphasis on young children in the park, named after her in Brooklyn, is in keeping with her love for orphans and economically challenged children. And that brings us to pivotal event number 10, our final pivotal event. What little money she had left as a result of the court battles, she used to help orphans, especially a little girl named Dorothy Coulter, whom she called her ward. They lived together in the Hotel McAlpin, which is over there on the right of your screen. When Bly became ill in January of 1922, she made her younger brother Harry and her niece Beatrice executors of her very meager estate, stipulating that what was left of her money go to orphans, including little Dorothy. Well, after Bly's death, Harry and Beatrice fought over their shares, typical of that family, which amounted to a pittance, and not much became of Nellie's request. In the end, Dorothy was adopted, got married, lived for many years in Florida, and then later in North Carolina, and passed away in 1998 at the age of 85. Dorothy had an interview with Brooke Kroger, the biographer, shortly before her death, and little Dorothy had nothing but fond memories of Nellie Bly. Yeah, you can see photos of Dorothy on the bottom of your screen, as well as Bly shortly before her death. There, it's in the, you could see Nellie Bly, 1921. The McAlpin Hotel, as I said, where Bly and Dorothy lived, that is there on your right. Well, the extraordinary pain of the family bickering certainly led to Bly's poor health. And she died of pneumonia at only 57 years of age on January the 27th of 1922 at St. Mark's Hospital, seen on the lower left of your screen. She was buried in a modest grave at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, with a simple tombstone. The New York Press Club erected what it considered a proper headstone on the 56th anniversary of her passing, and you can see it on the right of your screen. It reads, dedicated June 22nd, 1978 to Nellie Bly, Elizabeth Cochran Seaman, by the New York Press Club in honor of a famous news reporter. May 5, 1864, January 27, 1922. But I must add that if you get anything from this program today, it's that Nellie Bly was far more than a famous reporter. Yes, she was that in spades. But she was also an adventurer. She was an inventor. She was a businesswoman, and she was very much a humanitarian at heart. Sharing at the end of her life what amounted to a widow's mite to help underprivileged children. She was a complex, audacious, and intricately woven package of passions and beliefs. Now, as a postscript, I wanted to share this with you. Erasmus Wilson, who was the impetus for her very first article, and who would later become one of her closest friends, died on January 17th of 1922, just 10 days before Bly. And her very first newspaper, the Pittsburgh Dispatch, which began printing in 1880, published its last issue on Valentine's Day, 1923, just 1 year after Bly's death. Thus, in a little bit of poetry, Bly, Erasmus Wilson, and the Dispatch all ended together. It was truly the end of an era. So, there you have an overview of one of the most fascinating people of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I hope I've whetted your appetite to explore her life even more. Again, please visit my website to begin your own adventure and go to Deeper Dive number 1. Well, yours truly will be back Monday, if you can take it, for another remarkable woman for Women's History Month. And we will be looking at the life and times and loves of Eleanor Roosevelt, who is still probably considered by many people probably one of the most significant first ladies of this country, but more importantly, I think kind of like a first lady of the world, as you will see through her connection with the United Nations and other things. So hope you can be there on Monday, 6:30 Central Time, and I look forward to it. And thank you, Beth, for hosting tonight, and thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Mid-Continent Public Library.
Well, thank you for, as always, a very enjoyable presentation on a very fascinating person. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. The link to the survey is in the chat. I will also email it out along with the list of upcoming programs that I mentioned at the start. And we hope to see a lot of you back on Monday. Have a great evening.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.